Today we're looking at another Train Sim World route, which I'd say is one of the better US products that Dovetail has made, although that's not saying much given the often subpar quality of US add-ons in this game. Our subject is the Boston Sprinter DLC. No, that's a Class 153 Sprinter. That's actually an SNG Sprinter. That's not right either.
You think this is funny? In a cosmic sort of way, yes.
That's more like it. This add-on was released in August 2021 and features a 43-mile long section of the Northeast Corridor, starting at Boston South Station in Massachusetts and finishing in Providence, Rhode Island. It's mostly a linear route. I mean, it's Dovetail, what do you expect? But you do get to branch off the main line, once, for the 4-mile long branch line from Canton Junction to Stoughton. The overhead catenary throughout the route looks very modern compared to the old Pennsylvania Railroad catenary that you see south of New York, as the New Haven to Boston section wasn't electrified until the late 1990s. This train is one of the reasons why the wires were extended past New Haven. On the Amtrak side, this route only comes with the Siemens ACS-64 electric locomotive and Amfleet passenger coaches, representing the Northeast Regional Service. Initially, the ACS-64 only appeared in Phase 5 colours, but DTG have since added 662 in her Phase 3/TSW promotional livery as a free update. It begs the question as to why they didn't do the same for the Rainbow Ice 3 and Green Stripe Ice 1. It wasn't until February 2023 when DTG finally released the Acela as a long overdue addition to the Boston Sprinter. I think this route is a decent length for the MBTA commuter services, since they take at least an hour to get from Boston to Providence, but it's far too short for the Amtrak trains. I like how you can get the ACS-64 up to 125 miles per hour, and the Acela to 150, but that's somewhat spoiled by how little time it takes to cover the full route in these things, only around 42 minutes, and how short the 125/150 sections are. I think the route should have been extended to New Haven, Connecticut. That way we'd get the Wickford Junction Station, which is the southern terminus for MBTA, as well as a much longer run for the Amtrak locomotives. Not helping the situation is the fact that Amtrak trains only have 2 intermediate stops between Boston South and Providence, namely Boston Back Bay and Route 128. Ironically, this route was included in the TSW2 Rush Hour series, even though the only part of the route that has a truly busy service pattern is between Boston South and Reedville. Between Canton Junction and Providence, the route is incredibly spartan, with a rather infrequent service on both Amtrak and MBTA sides. I'm not sure if the MBTA timetable is prototypical, since it doesn't seem to match with the current schedule in real life. According to the real schedule, there's generally an hourly service down the Stoughton Branch, while the Providence service is either hourly or every 2 hours. Services going all the way to Wickford Junction, on the other hand, are much less consistent. For comparison, the other 2 rush hour routes, namely Nachwerke Dresden and London Commuter, have a much more intensive service pattern throughout most of the route. And in the case of Riesa to Dresden especially, you'll see a wide variety of electric locomotives and multiple units, with the occasional diesel cameo to boot. While London to Brighton has a good service pattern, I think that it looks rather dull when you're mostly seeing Southern 377s and Gatwick 387s. And although I've decided that I'll be getting the Class 700 when it's released, I'm rather peeved about the apparent, or rather convenient, memory issues preventing the 12-car variants from being added to the Brighton main line. So all we will be getting is the 8-car Class 700/0, which will at least make Southeastern high speed a bit more realistic. Anyway, after all that irrelevant filler, which will certainly make me want to stop reviews, or at least cut down the filler just to appease a select few critics, we now return to Boston Sprinter. Although I have no interest in the MBTA subway lines, I still think it's disappointing to not see the Hawker Siddeley or CRRC trains depicted on Orange Line services between Forest Hills and Boston Back Bay, where the subway lines run parallel to the main line. All the absence does is make the route feel lifeless and unrealistic. I get the feeling this route's development might have been rushed, though nowhere near as much as New York to Trenton. I mean, just look at the dodgy placement of the staircases at Ruggles, as well as the overlapping ground textures at Reedville, this floating poster at Attleboro, and sometimes I've seen posts at Boston South being too close to the track. The worst thing about this route, in my opinion, is the complete lack of variety in the MBTA equipment. All we get is the MPI F40PH-3C diesel locomotive and single-decker BTC3/CTC3 coaches. Every single MBTA service you'll see on this route consists of one locomotive at the southern end, then 4 BTC3 coaches and a CTC3 cab car at the northern end, and that's hardly realistic. I've never been to Boston myself, but from what I've seen in real footage, the MBTA often uses a bizarre mix of single and double-decker coaches in their trains, so it's disappointing to not see the BTC4 and CTC4 coaches in game. And Dovetail, although you probably don't take any notice of me, wouldn't be the first time someone's done that, I would still appreciate it if we could get the HSP46 locomotive, as well as those double-decker coaches added to the route. You could have also added the original F40PH-2C or F40PHM-2C as well, or maybe even just reskinned the existing MP36PH-3C model into MBTA colours. Weirdly, the F40 model will sometimes spawn in with the number 1073, despite the fact that the real 1073 doesn't exist anymore. She was written off and scrapped after the crash at Boston Back Bay in 1990. This isn't a criticism of DTG, but rather the MBTA themselves. I think it's quite silly that they still use diesel locomotives on services down the NEC to Providence and Wickford Junction, because that whole section is electrified apart from the platform at Wickford Junction. And that's another thing. Why did DTG cut the route 43 miles in at Providence instead of going all the way to Wickford Junction? It would have made the route a more desirable 62.9 miles long instead of a measly 43. For reference, the journey from Boston South to Stoughton covers 18.9 miles of track. And I will say that I do like doing the Stoughton run, because of the contrasting environments of the busy and built-up city of Boston versus the much more relaxed nature of the Stoughton Branch, not to mention the numerous different stations you pass through on the journey. Compared to the Providence service, it makes more sense to run diesels to Stoughton because the branch line isn't electrified. I would like to have seen the full Franklin line included as well as the Stoughton Branch. Players will be able to go all the way to Forge Park / Route 495 instead of being forced to leave the cab at Reedville. Most importantly, you get better use of the MBTA rolling stock, instead of it just being confined to the Providence and Stoughton services. Confusingly, Forest Hills on the Needham line, which is not served by Providence or Stoughton trains, has the same name as a station on the Long Island Railroad. Now this is a route that is in dire need of a major overhaul. Suggested improvements include a realistically busy timetable mode instead of a desolate ghost town, additional motive power like the DM30AC and M9, more accurate scenery, and route extensions to Port Washington, Oyster Bay, and Greenport via Ronkonkoma. As it stands now, this route is so bad that it's borderline unplayable. Something that I found confusing was the placement of EMD GP38-2s and CSX freight wagons at various sidings throughout the route, with Reederville Yard being a notable example. And yet you can't do any freight services. The inability to run freight trains on this route restricts the variety of services that you can operate, as if the route already being way too short and linear wasn't bad enough. Boston Sprinter suffers from the same problem as a lot of other US passenger routes, in the sense that DTG used the wrong destination screens, again. Apparently these are a British design, but don't quote me on that. And why Dovetail thought it was a good idea to keep reusing them on American routes is anyone's guess. Driving the MBTA rolling stock is interesting, to say the least, with the experience being quite different depending on which end of the consist you're at. The brakes on the F40PH-3C are much easier to use than the Caltrain F40PH-2 Cat's brakes, which have this bizarre lapped setup. I find that it's best to not go above notch 4 when you're pulling away from a station. Otherwise you'll put the ammeter needle in the red zone and risk overloading the traction motors. When you're driving north towards Boston from Stoughton, the speed limit doesn't go above 80 miles per hour. And yet, when you're going south towards Providence or Stoughton, you're able to reach and exceed 100 miles per hour depending on your stopping pattern. I'm guessing this is prototypical, but as I barely know anything about MBTA and the Northeast Corridor, I can't say for certain. Regarding the sounds, I think DTG could and should have done better with the MBTA locomotive. Comparing the sounds of the F40's horn in-game to real footage, what we've got in TSW barely sounds like the real thing. As for prime mover sounds, they're just as underwhelming and semi-inaccurate as the horn. It still sounds like an EMD engine, as it's supposed to, but I reckon DTG should have recorded new sounds from the real MBTA locomotive, instead of seemingly reusing an existing recording again. As for the ACS64, it's hardly surprising that this thing handles much better than the diesel, in terms of acceleration and braking at least. This locomotive has a combined throttle and dynamic brake lever, as well as two separate levers for the train and independent brakes, respectively. When I was testing the ACS64 for this review, I noticed that the dynamic brakes were quite weak, and I often had to use the normal train brake as well. As one would expect from some painfully ignorant yobbo in
far away
New Zealand, I don't know how accurate the in-game braking setup is for the ACS64. Regarding the sounds, and whether or not they're accurate, I'm going off real footage as reference material again. The horn sound is acceptable, I'll give them that, though for all I know the devs could have just used a synthesizer to make the horn sound instead of recording from the real thing. As for the motors, they're decently accurate as well, though I can't help thinking that the initial whine up to around 6 miles per hour just doesn't sound right. It's annoying that Dovetail couldn't get the Scepter license, in which case they would be able to extend their awful second NEC route to Philadelphia, and then they could have just reskinned the ACS64 into Scepter colours and added whatever coach is used by that commuter variant. Also, in before someone suggests putting this thing in Caltrain colours. As the trains on this route frequently exceed 80 miles per hour, this route is equipped with AC-SES in-cab signalling. It is disabled by default, and although it's less realistic, I prefer to drive the locomotives without the system enabled, as it can be rather annoying sometimes. In my experience, I've found that if you try to stick to the posted signal speed, it's impossible to run on time. When I've taken the F40PH-3C on services to Stoughton, I've found that it's a very tight timetable, even though you can push the thing to just over 100 miles per hour between Boston Back Bay and Route 128, as long as you're not stopping at Ruggles or Hyde Park. One feature that I particularly liked on the ACS64, although it doesn't really impact the gameplay too much, is the walkthrough interior. It's sort of like a much quieter version of a diesel locomotive's engine room. But,
and this is a big but,
this is an inconsistent feature, since it's not present on the BR146-2 and BR185 Trax locomotives, and only partially implemented on the Acela. In other words, in the Acela's case, it will let you walk through a small part of the interior, but there's an invisible wall just past the door. Meanwhile, this feature is fully implemented on the BR143, BR155, and BR182, or as I sometimes call it, the Blink 182. It's absolutely necessary in the case of the Taurus because the doors are not on the cab side, but rather in the middle of the locomotive. And why is this walkthrough interior thing so inconsistent? I think it's about time we got more Amtrak rolling stock and services represented in the game, outside of the Northeast Corridor, especially considering the real ACS64 that carried a TSW advert. Perhaps Dovetail could do something like a modern and up-to-date remake of Los Angeles to San Diego, in the same way that Rivet effectively did a reworked Edinburgh to Glasgow, although that route is absolute trash. I would want this Los Angeles to San Diego route to include the Amtrak and Coaster SC44 chargers, as well as the Metrolink MP36PH-3C or F125, and of course their respective coaches. Heck, even just the section from San Diego to Oceanside would suffice, although that would mean a charger-dominated rail scene, and probably no representation of the San Diego trolley services. In conclusion, I'd say Boston Sprinter is still pretty decent for those who like American passenger services. I just wish that the route building was higher quality, especially after the scenery on the Niedertalbahn put a lot of Dovetail and Rivet routes to shame. I also wish that there was more MBTA rolling stock included, and that the route coverage actually continued past Providence and down to New Haven, or at the very least, Wickford Junction. As it stands now, it's way too short for motive power as fast as the Acela and ACS64, but decent for the MPI F40PH-3C. As for whether or not you should check it out for yourself, I'll leave that up to you.